We're going live.
But it should disappear, no?
You just have to click OK in that for that window to go. We're going live.
I did, but it's not going anywhere. I clicked it, but it's not going anywhere.
Okay, I'll just check if we are live, if people can see us.
Where do you have to? There's nothing that says okay.
No, you should got it to show this thing.
Yeah.
This meeting is going live, got it. Yeah.
Should have gone.
Okay, so we are live. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Karwaan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. I'm Ishan Sharma, and you're watching the third session of the Karwaan Special Baithak, Sarhad ke is par us par, where we are not celebrating but remembering the 75 years of partition, because the nation is celebrating 75 years of independence, and somewhere we forget that the price that was paid was partition of the Indian subcontinent. And in this series, we are analyzing different aspects of partition, not just the political aspect, but what happened to the food of undivided India, what happened to women, what happened to people of different castes, what happened to uh, the textiles, what happened to the craft, what happened to arts and cinema, and different aspects of the whole partition tale. And in today's session, the other side of the silence, women and the pain of partition, we are going to talk about uh, the women's perspective of partition, because it is harder to discover. It exists in the private realm and in the stories told and retold inside so many households, even today in India and Pakistan. And to talk about women, we have two very special guests, two legends, as I was saying to Ritu ma'am, that two icons for us, uh, Ritu Menon and Urvashi Butalia. Ritu Menon is a feminist publisher and writer who has been active in the women's movement in India and in South Asia for almost 30 years. She is the author and editor of several books and anthologies, including the groundbreaking text Borders and Boundaries, Women in India's Partition, Out of Line, a literary and political biography of Nayantara Sahgal, address book, publishing memoir in the time of COVID, and most recently ZOHRA, a biography of in 4 acts of Zohra Sahgal, Zohra. Um, Now, Urvashi Butalia is an Indian feminist and publisher. Along with Ritu Menon, she co-founded Kali for Women, India's first exclusively feminist publishing house in 1984. In 2003, following the closure of Kali for Women, she founded Zubaan Books, and her main areas of interest are partition and oral histories of from a feminist perspective. And she has written on gender, communalism, fundamentalism, and media. And I think this is the first time that they are coming together on a panel in India. So they told me that they were on a panel together in the US, but it is the first time that we have uh, made this possible of having both of them together on a panel. So thank you so much, Ritu ma'am. Thank you so much, Urvashi ma'am, for agreeing to do this. And also, we usually have a second moderator, Sadaf Hussain, who is one of our co-hosts and co-curator of this whole series, who's a chef and author. But as it is Eid today, he's celebrating it with his family. So happy Eid to Sadaf Bhai and all those who are celebrating it world over. So the format is that we have the opening remarks from both our speakers for about 10 minutes each. Then we'll open the conversation where we'll talk about various aspects of this perspective. All speakers are allowed to ask each other questions. And we'll take audience questions in between. So those who are watching us on YouTube, please send in your questions in the YouTube live chat, which I'll be reading in between the conversation. So Ritu ma'am, if you would like to start with the opening remarks.
Okay. Thank you first, of course, for inviting us. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. And even though it's been a very long time since doing any further research on this, when you wrote and asked about, asked us to be present today, I say this evening that is not already, in the books that we wrote and in other, subsequently the other volumes that I edited and so on. And I thought that I would actually go back to the very first question that we raised when we began researching this project in the late 80s. And when we started working on this oral history of women's experience of partition, one of the central question actually in our minds was this: what does country mean for women? What does that entity, what meaning does it have for women? How do they define it? Do they define it at all? And if they define it, do they define it as something territorial, as something with physical characteristics, as an abstraction, as symbolic? What meaning does it simply because of course it was a country that was divided? Questions them was, would they, for example, die for their country? Would that value for them? Would it be something that would impel them into action? On the ground and across our interviews, we found, not very surprisingly, we found that for the majority of women, it was, and I know that Urvashi would have found the same because it is common. We found that for the majority of the women we spoke to, their village or town or city much more important than a notion of country or nation. That home where they had been born and where they wanted to die. And that the division of countries on the basis of religion had absolutely no meaning for them whatsoever. Again and again, they told us that it made no difference to them who, quote unquote, ruled the country, as long as in the place that they lived in. But was there another way of thinking about the country that other, after all, not all women speak in the same way, and not all women agree on what country means, just as not all women agree on what anything else means. And at it, where should one put this? Where should one find these diverse ways of articulating this notion of country? I'm sure there are many, many different ways and many different places that one can find this. But what I thought I would do is to read to you from 3 or 4 short texts that were written immediately post-independence, post-partition, by 4 very well-known writers, to illustrate a little bit of my point. The 4 writers are Sara Soleri from Pakistan, Kuratelan Haider, Ismat Chugtai, and Atia Hussain from India. So I'm going to read very briefly from them and then very briefly make a comment before handing it over. So the first piece, the very short piece, Pakistani writer in the mid-90s. Somehow called Middle Days. It's from the very first chapter called Dadi, my father's mother, was born in Meerut towards the end of 16 and widowed in her 30s. Never exactly.
I think yeah. Ritu ma'am, you are on mute. There was some internet glitch. You have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
When India was partitioned in August of 1947, she moved her thin, pure Urdu into the Punjab of Pakistan and waited for the return of her eldest son, my father. Dadi was peeved. She had long since dispensed with any loyalties larger than the pitiless give and take of people who are forced to live together in the same place, and she resented independence for the distances it made. She was not among those who, on the 14th of August, unfurled flags and festivities against the backdrop of people running and cities burning. About that era, she would only say, looking up sour and cryptic over the edges of her Quran. And this is what she said. And I was also burned. I said, as actually formed the kernel of the film Garam Hawa by M.S. Satyu, which you may have seen, and for which Isma Chugtai actually wrote the screenplay. But this is from the story. And here is another Dadi. This is a Dadi. She says, own country? Of what feather is that bird? And tell me, good people, where does one find it? The place one is born in, that soil which has nurtured us. Am I there or have I gone off? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, you are there. We have turned off the video for better. Yeah, into.
Okay. The place one is born in, that soil which has nurtured us, if that is not our country, can an abode of a few days hope to be it? And then who knows? We could be pushed out of there too and told to find a new home, a new country. I'm at the end of my life. Time was, the Mughals left their country and came to create a new one here. Now you want to pick up and start again? Is it a country or an uncomfortable shoe? If it pinches, exchange it. The third text is from Atya Hussain. Very quickly, I'll read it. It's from a novel that she never finished. She wrote it, but she never finished it. And it is an exchange between two young men, one from India, one from Pakistan, in a restaurant run by a Bangladeshi in London. The two of them are sitting over a drink and reminiscing because one of them says he thinks he wants to leave England and go back. This is the exchange. There was a time, my friend, appearance and reality to be. Are you Indian? Just one said, are you alive? And I, living or partly living? Let's drink to partly living. They drank. But my friend, said Murad, The time did come for questions. You and I together did need explanations. Indian, yes. Pakistani, yes. Both Muslims, yes. Yet different, yes. How? Why not? Appearance the same. Reality, different. Let us drink to the different sameness. Let us drink. To Pakistan, where you went. To India, where you will return. To the Siamese twins. To their midwife. Rule Britannia. Come now, my brother, my friend, we have been made to fight enough. Let us drink to freedom. They drank to freedom with tears in their eyes. But when freedom came, where was I? When the country cracked apart, I was on the other side of a bloody chasm. I swore loyalty to the background of a cry of hate against my father's country, against your country, against my country that was. Tell me then who I am, what I am, with no roots attached to any piece of earth, a creature mechanically walking and talking, with no sense of history anymore. Tell me, what is history? Dates, battles, or the story of all that nurtured me and made me part of a culture? What language is mine now? And the last piece is from Gurtalan Haidar's great novel, Kadaria, which is, of course, a multi-generational, critic, organic novel, which begins 2,000 years ago and ends with partition. And here, it's a short piece. One of her characters, Kamal Raza, is on a ship going back to India that is newly independent. While they were crossing the channel, the discussion drifted towards E.M. Forster. The British poet said, Forster wrote his novel in 1924, at which time he created Dr. Aziz as a representative Indian. Dr. Aziz is no longer Indian. Muslims are now identified only with Pakistan. He glanced at Kamal and added, now, our Kamal Reza is not the typical Indian, only our Pandit Gaur is. The remark hit Kamal between the eyes. He sat there motionless. Lightning seemed to have struck him. Perhaps he was now stateless. The friends continued to sip beer and talk of other things while they passed slowly through the date palm-lined muddy waters. A full moon was rising sluggishly over the horizon. The boat moved forward with ease and dignity. Snow-white foam shone in the moon. Everywhere, on all the oceans of the globe, all manner of ships were sailing on this seemingly shoreless sphere of liquid moonlight. I have probably become stateless, Kamal said politely to a French monk on the deck chair next to him. And this is not your Sukhvati, your state of bliss, brother Anand. He went back to his cabin and did not emerge again on the deck. So each one of the writers, one of these writers, has offered up a very particular and individual understanding of country and of belonging. This question of belonging haunted all of their imaginations, and they returned to it again and again. For Haidar, in all her novels, the question of territory or even country had far less importance for her than the value of syncretism and of creative coexistence. This would become her definition of India, a place, a civilization that was simultaneously ancient and contemporary, continuous yet always in flux, in which individual and collective lives are lived. And it was this idea of India that partition threatened. But for Chugtai and Suleri, this idea acquired a territorial geographic identity, became a physical place to which one either goes or stays behind in. Here, the attachment to place is visceral. Both dadis cling to it. The sense of dislocation that Soleri's Dadi experiences is so extreme that she believes the fires that raged during partition resulted in her own symbolic psychological conflagration. She never recovers her equity. Atia Hussein's, quote, country is the no man's land of exile. Her two protagonists have renounced their erstwhile country, India, by physically leaving it after partition and living in England, a place that can never become their country. The country they have left now exists only as a memory or as painfully, futilely unattainable. Their unbelonging is real and almost unbearable. They drown that realization in drink. What to all a profound sense of loss in which self and country are intertwined, imprinted. The predicament that they describe is with us still, and the question of nation and of belonging has recurred in many different articulations over the decades and does so today too, in the 75th year of our independence. And I think it does so today with even greater urgency and significance than it did in the years that these novels were written.
Thank you, Ritu ma'am, for that opening remark. And I think it brings more questions about the sense of belonging. How do we perceive a sense of belonging, or is it gendered sense of belonging? Does it mean differently for different genders of different uh, groups? But we'll talk about that in the conversation. Urvashi ma'am, over to you for the opening remarks.
Thank you, Ishan, and thanks, Ritu. Good to listen to you after so long. Ishan, thank you, Karwaan, for having me here. I'm delighted to be here. And Sadaf, sorry to miss you, but repeating the Eid Mubarak and hoping you're having a great time with your family. So, like Ritu, I haven't done much work on partition for many years now. After I finished The Other Side of Silence, I had planned to come back to partition and perhaps do another book, but that didn't happen, although I did do an edited volume. What I've succeeded in doing is some essays and bits and pieces of work in many ways. But what has happened is that partition hasn't left me. In a sense, the stories just keep coming. People ring up and tell you stories, they email and tell you stories, you meet them and they tell you stories. So I want to begin by telling one such story to you. Some of you may know it because it's not new. I've written about it and I've spoken about it. So if you're familiar with it, please forgive me. But if not, well, it's a strange story and I will move on from there. So this is a story of a woman called Shehnaz, who I met in Karachi some 5-6 years ago. I've now forgotten how many years ago it was. And I met her at a literature festival and she spoke a little bit about her life pre-partition and post-partition. And I wanted to hear more about it. So I spent a day with her at her home, talking to her. And this is her very Ajeeb Dastan kind of story. That at the time of partition, she was about 16 years old. She was then a young Sikh woman with the name of Gurbachan. And as with many families, she and her extended family were fleeing to what they hoped would be safety when they were attacked and many people were killed. And Shehnaz and 5 of her friends, who were all roughly the same age, around 16, were each abducted by one or other of the abductors or men who came along. The story as it is told, and there are 2 different versions here. One of them is that her abductor then married her. Another version is that the man who married her was not her abductor, but somebody who rescued her from an abductor. I don't know which of these 2 is actually correct. But once she was married, she converted and she became Shehnaz. And then she and her husband together had 5 children, 4 daughters and 1 son. And in about the early 60s, a visitor from India came and met them and mentioned that her parents had actually survived the attack and they were living in Amritsar, not in the city, but close by. So the husband, Afzal Beg and Shehnaz, decided to come to Amritsar to meet her family, to visit the family. And they came with their 5 children. And there was a reunion, and the parents were, of course, so happy to see their daughter again. And likewise, she was happy to see them. But when it came to the time for her to return to Pakistan, they didn't let her go. And they said that your husband can go, you can keep the children if you like, but we won't let you go back with that man and to Pakistan. So they coercively kept her back, and they made her convert back to Gurbachan. And she was then married to a man who had a young son, a widower who had a young son. And her husband went back to Pakistan with her children and remarried over there. And then the 2 lives did not come together again. But what happened was that many years later, 50 years later, the husband had by now died, and Gurbachan had moved to the United States or Canada, I don't know which of the 2 countries, with her son, who was now grown up and a professor over there. And again, this is not entirely clear, but I think the story is that in conversations with her son, he discovered that his mother had an earlier life. And he then suggested to her that she try to find her children in Pakistan. And they put an advertisement in a Pakistani paper saying a mother seeks her children and described the story. At first, it had no results. And then subsequently, they put it out in Urdu. Initially, they had published it in English. And when they put it out in Urdu, lo and behold, her children, now grown up, adults with children of their own, saw it and said, this is our mother. And so when I met her, she had come to Pakistan on a 3-month visa on compassionate grounds. Her firm belief was that that was where she wanted to stay because that was her home, that was where she belonged, that was where her family was. So all the issues that Ritu was raising about country belonging, home, nationality, etc., come alive very much in this story. And she did not know whether the Pakistan government would give her a visa to stay the rest of her life in Pakistan. But she had that 3-month visa. And in her commitment to her family, she had re-become Shehnaz. So that's as far as I know the story, because I didn't hear from her after that. But when I heard it 5-6 years back, it kind of solidified for me something that I had been feeling and something that became clear for me at that time, which is that how much more there is to learn about this moment in our history. It's been, in the past 2 decades, there have been so many fascinating explorations of partition and its many histories. And with each new exploration, something hitherto unaddressed becomes visible. And I'm reminded of a book of essays that I edited now, even that's quite a long time back, I think it was 2017, which shed light on histories of partition in the Northeast, in Ladakh, in Kutch, in Dandakarnya, and so many other places. And they were not only histories of different places, but of different forms in which stories of partition had been expressed, such as art, literature, graphic stories, and so on and so forth. It was at that time that the idea of spatiality, for example, which did not find a place in our work, I think, but which now seems such an obvious scene to explore, it became apparent. So for example, I teach a course in feminism at different universities. And one of those universities, which is located in Ahmedabad, focuses on the built environment and public space. And it was in looking at partition histories and the stories that I had collected from the point of view of public space that I began to see something that I had not seen before, which was really how the nature of public space changed drastically for women at that time, because the segregation between the private and the public was suddenly upturned, and the street on which the long kafilas traveled for 2 months became the mirror of the domestic space. And therefore, it kind of all got upturned. The street was where women cooked, it was where they slept, it was where they looked after their families, all the chores that they are supposed to do. And yet, actually, there is also the fact that if you look at this changing or transformation of public space in terms of caste, you see it as very different from upper caste women, for whom the restrictions between the inner and the outer world are much, much sharper than they are for scheduled caste, lower caste women, and so on. Another thing that became clear to me through a chance encounter with a young woman who had written a wonderful paper on the Northeast and partition was about the nature of markets. So this paper talked about how in the Khasi Hills for the tribals, as partition became imminent, their livelihoods were deeply impacted when Sylhet went to Pakistan, because what actually happened was that the supplies that they used to get, for which they used to set up their weekly markets, suddenly dried up, and they had no idea of what had happened. So even the impact in, one would think in an unlikely place with tribals in the Khasi Hills, that too was something that kind of became clear to me in the last few years when I have been looking at things. And last week or the week before, I was in a webinar with teachers from across India and different places who are trying to look at different ways of teaching partition and partition histories in the classroom, now that sections of it have been excised from the textbooks. And in the kinds of sources that they had found were really fascinating, including, for example, from the archives of the princely state of Mysore, where a lot of partition refugees had gone, and there were photographs and letters and documents and so on, tracking family histories. So in a sense, this is a very, very rich, very ongoing kind of exploration. And I find this very exciting because even though we are at the stage where there are hardly any direct survivors who can tell us their stories, there are so many ways in which the stories that we have are being told and retold and re-represented. Now, let me quickly turn then. Today, we are meant to talk about women, a subject that both Ritu and I have explored in depth. And I want to focus on some aspects of it that haven't had that much attention. I'm not going to repeat what we already know. We know the stories of the terrible violence and of the sexual assault by men of the other community, often by men of women's own communities. We know the stories of rape, the mutilation, the marking of women's bodies with the symbol of the other religion. We know how the whole question of sexual violence of women became one in which women's bodies came to symbolize the nation, the religion, the community, the family. We also know now about family violence and the complex ways in which women's deaths by suicide, if we can call it that, became part of the lexicon of women's histories of the time, and which today has so many resonances in this thing so wrongly called honor killings. We're also lucky to have some memoirs and both fiction and non-fiction accounts. Ritu's read to you from some of those fictional accounts and also non-fictional ones. We also know that there were times at which partition pushed some women, largely upper class and upper caste women, into public life and opened up for them professions such as social work, stitching, etc. And we know that partition wasn't only a tale of victimhood, but one also of survival and courage. And of course, we know about the recovery operation, which Ritu has written about in great detail. But most recently, partition studies have begun to focus on another forgotten history, that of caste, and within that, the question of caste and gender, more specifically, women. So I want to talk a little about that now, and I'm going to draw first on my own work, then on that of Ravinder Kaur. Some of you may have seen the very interesting piece today that was in the Indian Express about an area in Karol Bagh called Regarpura, that housed largely Dalit and low-caste refugees, and that piece is mostly based on Ravinder's work. And then the very interesting work of a scholar called Ekta Bakshi. So in my book, I told the story of Maya Rani, a Dalit woman from Punjab, who I interviewed and who is the one whose chance remark about having escaped the violence, she and her friends, because they were neither Hindu nor Muslim, but they were Dalit, is what alerted me to histories of caste. And then I began to explore them. I won't repeat Maya's story because it's there. And I think if you haven't read it, you'll find it in the book. And I don't want to take too much time. Maya lived in a small town, but in urban areas in Punjab, there were many other experiences of Dalits, experiences of caste. One of them we know today, and Ravinder has talked a lot about that. I made some reference to it in my work, but she has a whole book on that, which talks about how in urban areas, there was an attempt on the part of the establishment, the state, to stop Dalits from leaving, because with their departure, the kind of systems, essential services and sanitation systems, etc., of the cities in which they lived would fall apart. This was in urban areas. In rural areas, the experiences were interestingly somewhat different. In the eastern part, for example, many lower caste people were poor landless laborers or those who had tiny plots of land. Often they didn't leave because of communal violence or because the violence of partition forced them out, but they left just because the moment provided them with an opportunity to move somewhere where perhaps because of the relief and rehabilitation operation, they could have a chance of doing better. Ekta Bakshi's work looks at this and points out that for Dalits and scheduled caste people, partition migration was not necessarily a coercive displacement caused by increasing violence. Often it was a moment which offered the possibility of moving elsewhere, and it opened up the possibility of opportunity which was non-existent at home. And she tells the story of a community that had to move because their land, however little, was being progressively taken over by the river Padma, and moving to the other side meant that they could at least access some government benefits. The stories of people like this, that is the stories of low caste poor people, did not follow the usual trope of middle or upper class displacement, where you left behind property, where you left behind jewelry, where you left behind businesses, and then with government help, you slowly, often painfully reconstructed your life. The more common refugee story of survival. Instead, here there's nothing to celebrate, for the life you leave behind is dismal. The life you go to is not very different because the state's policies of rehabilitation are often casteist. And yet, you sort of make your life in relief camps and settlements set up by the government, but you don't have the same kind of opportunities that are offered for revival. There's no bank loans or training or even housing and so on and so forth. So this, I think, in a sense, also impacts on how you remember that moment of leaving, because the loss, the nostalgia associated with the departure, which is there in the stories of many upper caste people, may not be there in the stories. I'm not saying it isn't, but may not be there in the stories of scheduled caste and other people, because when there's nothing to lose, when there is no objects, no land, no properties, nothing, when you're escaping hunger and you're going to possible hunger, how do you remember? What do you remember? Now, what did this mean for women? There is a story in Ekta's work that I was very interested by of a woman called Togor Bala, whose family moved, and as did she was a mere child, but she was married, although she hadn't yet attained puberty and started menstruating. And what the move meant, even though it may have represented some change in the conditions they faced at home, it meant the loss of an informal structure of female support from elder women in the life situations that you were in. For example, when you started menstruating. So when she started menstruating for the first time, there were no women around to help. So it was dealing with the shame and the bewilderment of that kind of on your own. And also that, it's a kind of something, the move isn't something that stops. The vulnerability kind of continues, because once you look at the experiences of the Namashudras in Dandakarnya, you see that there is endless vulnerability and being pushed around from here and there just because of the question of caste. I'm going to close. I just want to have two other remarks to make. That in my book, when I looked at the question of memory, one of the questions I asked was, what does one remember and how does one remember? And I recall this, that when I spoke to families whose women had been abducted, their way of dealing with the loss of those women was to completely wipe out their memory. It was as if those women had never existed. And for those women, when they started life in their new families, if they were in their new families, their way was also to wipe out that memory completely altogether. So in a sense, the silences of history sometimes in the experiences of women and the experiences of scheduled castes kind of mirror each other, even though women is a large category that always needs to be separated. But, if women had to remember, what would they remember when they had been so forgotten by their families? If lower caste people had to remember, what would they remember the poverty and the dire situations that they faced? And how can we romanticize that kind of memory? I think these are just, I don't have an answer to these questions. I think these are just very, very interesting areas of discussion that the new kinds of discussions are opening up. I think that's really all I wanted to say, except that I also wanted to mention that in my own work, I have talked about how the fact that upper class women worked in rehabilitation centers and so on, and the fact that many women who were rescued and recovered got trained to take up new jobs. Many widows were incorporated into the system, and they worked in the Silai centers where they stitched uniforms for class 4 employees, and that is how they made their living. So in a sense, the crisis pushed women into certain kinds of economic activity that allowed them to deal with the social ostracization that society would otherwise exercise towards widows. But while we know this, what we don't know is how many of these Silai centers, and there were many of them across many northern cities, or how many of these rehabilitation operations actually made a space for lower caste women. And I suspect there is very little information about that. And I don't think we are going to find out much about it either, but it would be very interesting to see that. So my last point is that there are so many rich themes, but what is also exciting to me is that so much of this work is being done by young people, and it's taking new and exciting forms. I mean, Shan, there you are organizing these discussions. There are people doing graphic stories. There are people making virtual reality things. There's all kinds of things happening. It's taken us 1/2 to 3/4 of a century to start the process of remembering and coming to terms. And I think that perhaps there will come a time, I hope there will come a time, when this process of remembering and coming to terms will not be done in isolation, but we'll be able to do it together with each other. So I've spoken for more than 10 minutes. Sorry about that, but thank you for giving me the chance.
Thank you so much, Urvashi ma'am. Thank you so much, Ritu ma'am, for those opening remarks. I'll also ask you to start the video. I hope the internet is now better. There were many interesting points in both of your opening remarks. The last point especially, I'll come to that first, and then I'll come to Ritu ma'am. So Urvashi ma'am and Ritu ma'am can also come in this question. That has there been a collective amnesia of sorts with regard to the brutality of violence, or the brutality of partition and violence that was faced by communities, women, men, children, and forced migration of people that happened? Because, as you said, for many decades nobody talked about these themes. What's your experience of interviewing people?
Ritu, do you want to go first? You're muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Can you? No?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Can you? You can? Can you? I have unmuted.
Should I? Yes, ma'am. Now you can.
Yes?
Yes. Now we can hear you.
So I think just turn off the video then.
Yes, I've done that.
Okay. So I think this business of amnesia, I don't know, when we were doing all the research on oral history, on oral history and on trauma, especially on trauma, the question of amnesia became very important because there seemed to be a general consensus that it requires one generation, amnesia for one generation before memory can be activated. That very traumatic, very violent ruptures. And most of this work was done with reference to the Holocaust in Europe, but it was also done with reference to the breakup of Yugoslavia. And many researchers at the time actually theorized that this business of remembering required one generation of forgetting, or if not forgetting, suppressing. That it is not a question of amnesia, but a question of suppressing memory. That certainly happened for a lot of our family. My family, for example, never talked about it. Never. None of my aunts, my mother, my grandmother, my uncles, that generation, the generation that actually experienced it and had to move from Lahore or Miyawali or Gujranwala, wherever they came from, to India, never mentioned it, not once. So what we grew up with was a very different kind of absence of memory, but presence of experience. The experience was ever present because in everyday conversation, it was before partition and after partition. It was like BC and AD. In other words, it had become a watershed moment for the family. That was the extent of the recall. And of course, not sort of incidents and vignettes and memories of friends and of what we did when we were here and what we did when we were there and so on and so forth. But that was the extent of it. There was never any exploration in depth. I regretted very much the fact that I could not speak to my grandmother, because what I would have got from her would have been very, very different from what I heard from the women that we interviewed, for example. I regretted very much not being able to talk to my granduncle, who was in an army truck, in a military truck, that was actually being by Muslim army men. It was one of the means of that had been to for safe of people moving to the other. And this granduncle recounted to his son, who told me, but I never got a chance to ask, shall we kill him? Shall we kill him? Shall we let him live? And the entire journey was spent in wondering whether he would reach his destination alive or dead. He too, like Sarah Souleri's grandmother, never recovered his equal. Now, I would have liked to have spoken to him. What memory would he have had? So I'm saying that but it was never part of conversations within the family. It was like, in a way, a chapter closed, but a chapter that was always a part of the book, part of the story. When we began interviewing the women, actually, 2 or 3 different things happened, and we found, and this is not at all surprising, not at all unusual. For so many of the women, this was the first time that someone was actually asking them what had happened, was actually interested in listening to their experience and according to it some importance, some value, some meaning, that it was significant in some way that was not personal, that was not individual, that was not domestic, that was not irrelevant. It became very important, and often they would ask us to come back and say, we have much more to tell you. There is much more that we need to share with you. Now, this is of course, a way of remembering that is therapeutic, that could be said to be therapeutic, that could be said to be a compensation for the kind of almost near irrelevance that their lives had, a near irrelevance that their lives had begun to acquire in their own understanding. I have to say that these were all women without families. They were in refugee centers. Okay, but there were others, many others, and just as Urvashi has said, so many found their feet post-partition. We spoke to several of them too. And in fact, one of them, who became a college principal, she said, this was a wonderful thing that happened. It gave me freedom. It allowed me to find myself. It gave me independence. I became educated. I went into higher education. I wouldn't have done anything if I had continued to live in Karachi, which is where she came from. To the extent that she left her husband and brought up her daughters on her own, because she now had a salary of teacher and subsequently a college principal. So there were lots of, and her memory obviously is very different. And indeed, as Urvashi said, there were those whose memories were totally, as I said, suppressed or never allowed to be articulated. And we did meet a few of those as well. One particular woman who had been abducted and whom we actually spent, and her story is in the book, but she simply refused to talk about that. She said, I will talk about my life today, but I will not talk about what happened to me at that time. So I think that the question of amnesia needs to be understood at many different levels, in many different registers. And, there is, that Aanchal has been doing all this work on material memory and so on, all different ways of arriving at a particular understanding of a traumatic event. I just want to add one thing to this, which is, that when we started, we actually wanted to do a 3-country study, that is, look at Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, because the central notion was the notion of country. What did that country mean? And what made it, made something that became important in the memory, in the memorializing, in the recounting, in the living, in the experience. What was that experience of? And I have to say that, and I said this is not too disputed either, that for Bangladesh, we found it very difficult in the 80s and early 90s to find anyone who wanted to actually even inquire into that period, because they wanted to forget that interregnum of East Pakistan. That was a different suppression of memory, different suppression. No one wanted to talk except the Biharis. That particular aspect was very real. It would to inquire to the in Bangladesh. It couldn't be done by an researcher or a Pakistani researcher. That would have been completely completely, I think, unacceptable at one level. But they were not interested in speaking about what happened between 47 and 71. They were interested in speaking about the liberation of Bangladesh from Pakistan. That East Pakistan interregnum is not something they wanted to remember. And actually, very, very on that in Bangladesh. A few stray sort of attempts have been made, but at some literature recently, very recently. But just speaking about amnesia, that 30-year amnesia there, or that 25-year amnesia is still very, very much in evidence. As far as Pakistan is concerned, partition was not partition, it was the creation of Pakistan. And so there's another kind of, and of course, it is treasonous to question the creation of Pakistan in that country. And so there is a very different, memory that comes into play there. I mean, we do still have interviews with women there, which of course we cannot ever use because they're not ours to use, but they are there as an archive. So I think that for the entire subcontinent, this particular event has had so many reverberations that we are feeling to this day, particularly here, particularly in India, that to continue with this exploration and these very many new and extremely important and fascinating inquiries that are being conducted are a most invaluable historical resource. And I just hope that they don't remain sequestered in libraries and within academia, but actually begin to become public, in public memory, not just individual memory, which is one problem that I have with the partition museums, but we won't go into that now.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for that answer. And absence of memory, presence of experiences, I think is an important statement to understand in today's India. But there are other questions that comes from your remark, that is, do we have this absence of a language for trauma in our society? That is a question that an author that you mentioned also raises in her recent book, Achal Malhotra, in her recent book, in the language of remembering. But we'll talk about that later. But Urvashi, ma'am, your remarks on the question.
Actually, I don't have anything very much to add, Ishan. Ritu has brought forward a lot of points, so maybe we should just move forward on the discussion. I'll just add that it's not easy to remember violence. The instinct is, it takes a lot of courage to remember it. And then, of course, connected with that is the question which you're raising now, which is, do we even have the language or the vocabulary to actually articulate and remember violence? And for example, do women have the vocabulary to be able to describe and talk about sexual violence? So what happens then? So I just add those two things as thoughts to think about, but let's move on to other issues and questions that we may have.
Yeah. So there's another question that Ritu ma'am mentioned in the beginning of in the opening remarks, which was about literature, where she mentioned Kuratloon Heather and others. So there's also another young, I think, modern times writer, Intizar Hussain, and his book called Basti, which came out in 1979, where he kind of tries to excavate the pain of the loss of home as recollected by the novel's protagonist, who is a historian called Zakir. So my question to Ritu ma'am is that how does these writers, especially because you mentioned literature, invoke the past or use the civilizational memory to heal the wounds of this loss of home, this loss of their memories, that is partition?
I don't have I don't have a direct response to that question, Ishan, because it's a very complex and very not easy to to reduce to an answer in that way. What interests me is, for example, Intizar Hussain, Manto, Krishan Chandar, all these people writing about partition. And I just want to make one very brief comment to Urvashi's remark about how difficult it is to write violence. Where is that language? And I remember another poet whom we both know, Meena Alexander, saying to me once that, we enter a zone of what she called radical illiteracy, when we begin to try and find a language or try and find the words to actually articulate something that becomes almost, that is so elusive, but also so intractable. I found that all these guys who are writing about it find that language much more easily somehow, meaning they are much more easily able to articulate what is country, what is nation, what is calm, what is community, what is honor, what is self, who is the self, where is the, at least the writers that you have mentioned, the writers that I'm mentioning. I find Manto has been valorized so much with Kholdo and Thanda Ghosh and all of that. I find those stories shocking. I don't think any woman would have written that idiom, because it is not possible to write in that idiom if you have had that experience. Do you see what I'm trying to say? For me, when I mention these four writers that I read from, as women trying to articulate what the notion of country or nation is, this is the significant difference that I want to highlight. It's not that disadvantaged, disempowered, dispossessed men would not articulate it in the same way. They may well do so. It's just that in our experience, when we were interviewing, particularly, for example, when we did a few interviews in Bengal with refugees who had come over from what was then East Pakistan into Calcutta, where the question of caste became very, very important. The way the men were remembering that event, they were always present. They were always present in the room because they said, the women, what will they tell you? They don't remember anything. We will tell. And when they left the room, we got a completely different version, which is not at all surprising. This is also pretty common. But what I'm saying is, what interests me is A, the language that is used, B, the tropes that are used, B, the self-identification. How do these guys that are writing about these things identify with what they are writing? And how do the women identify with it? Is there a difference? Is there a difference that tells us something about how they experience that very major transition? Now, as I said, as far as Haider is concerned, for example, she thinks that this whole business of dismembering is a complete travesty, because she's interested in continuity. She identifies with that. She identifies with what she finds is a historical continuum. That for her is country. And the rupturing of it is what she finds a travesty. So here is a writer who went to Pakistan and came right back because that travesty simply did not exist for her as a country. She spent several years there and then came right back. That to me is very interesting. Would Manto have returned? It's a question that I have asked again and again of myself. Obviously can't ask him, but we know he died. We know he drank himself to death. Obviously there was something profoundly dislocating in that experience for him. And I mean, there are many others such, and this is, the question that Urvashi raised about spatiality, for example, I think is extremely interesting and important. And we must look at it, because after all, what is territory if not a definition of space? If not a defining of boundaries, if not an insistence on its integrity, what does it mean? What else is it if not that? And for me, the question of how that space, whether it's the domestic space or the public space or the national space, is experienced by, is what I am I'm extremely interested in learning about.
Can I just say, Ishan, that I was smiling when Ritu talked about Manto, because I remember taking my courage into my hands in a literature festival. It was at the JLF, a large gathering, and there was a discussion on Manto, and I was one of the speakers, and I said I found him to be misogynistic, and I didn't like him much, and I was nearly lynched for that. I mean, had I been sitting in the audience, I think I would have been lynched. So it's like he's a god, but reduces so many women to the sum of their body parts. That,
absolutely. And they keep comparing him to Chuktai, and I keep saying, this is nonsense. You cannot compare him to Chuktai. I mean, what are you doing? And like Urvashi, I said it in some meeting or the other, and I can't remember where. And everyone greeted me with complete shock, and actually with censure. How dare you say something like that? But quite frankly, I think he's highly overrated in terms of what he supposedly has done or written or so on.
I think we'll have to have a separate discussion on Manto someday with both of you. And I think there's a new translated volume that has just come out on Manto. But moving ahead, because we have mentioned violence, the word violence, a lot in this conversation. So when there is a discussion on women and partition, if at all, it often in the terms of the gendered violence that that they witnessed or is mentioned. So it is true that they were raped, kidnapped, murdered, sexually assaulted during and after the partition, but is limiting their experience only to gendered violence justified, or is there a word beyond that, or an experience beyond that as well for women? How do you see that?
I don't think either of us is limiting their experience only to gendered violence.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that
So in general, in scholarship in general.
No, I think actually there's been a lot of scholarship, Ishan, that has moved beyond that. Having said that, I don't think that it is a small thing to, gendered violence is a small thing. I mean, first of all, I think the question should be that partition histories were written for so many years without even looking at the issue of gender as if it was non-existent. And then as a result of the work of feminist historians, you start to see a whole exploration of gendered violence and sexual violence. But over and beyond that is what lies underneath is the ways in which the nation is being imagined and the ways in which women's bodies are being imagined and so on. But subsequent to that, and Ritu's referred to it, I've referred to it in this talk, looking at how for many women partition became a moment when they could move into something different, became something where their lives changed. And there are a whole range of other explorations opening up which have to do with women and which have to do with the intersections of caste and gender and with tribal women and so on and so forth. So I don't think that it is only being looked at in terms of gendered violence, but we should never use the term only with gendered violence either.
Thank you for that answer, ma'am. I think it was necessary to ask that question because we keep hearing it. Ritu ma'am, any comments, or should we move to the other?
No, I agree with Urvashi, and I do think that this what happens very often, and I think that's what you meant, is that it gets reduced just to that.
Yeah.
That the question becomes one only of physical or sexual violence. Whereas actually, I think that what both of us were trying to do, and whether we succeeded or not, I can't say, was to see how the whole notion of family, community, and religion actually aids and abets the gendering. Partition became that moment when it became extraordinary. It is persistent even in the ordinary. It is persistent at an everyday level. What happened during partition was that they all came together in an extraordinary moment. And what does that moment tell us about all of these entities, family, community, country, state, nation, masculinity, femininity, etc., etc. And if, in fact, the body of the woman symbolizes all of that, then it transcends the question of gender violence. It becomes much, much, much larger. It becomes a comment on the way a whole society is imagined, a whole nation is imagined, a whole narrative is constructed, a whole history gets written. We must see it in that light, and not simply as something that happened to women because they were assaulted. See.
Yeah. So because you talked about the sense of nation and belonging to a certain extent in the opening remarks, this is a question for both of you, because in cities are made by after historical processes. The cities that we inherit were part of the past, and past experiences shaped histories and shaped societies and cities. So the violence that the partition inflicted on people, or the experience that the people had, did that shape in the way we live in? Because in every city that I have been, there is this Musalman Mohalla, designated place for the Muslims in India, where all the Muslims live, and then there is a general space where all other communities live. You see this segregation, these fractured identities as a legacy of partition, a saddening legacy, but a legacy of partition. These fractured identities.
I think, I don't know, may I just say very briefly a comment on that, which is, I think that partition history, the partition history on violence has been dominated by, okay? That is what we remember when we remember the violence. We remember the massacres and the bloodletting and the trains full of dead bodies and corpses and so on. When you go to the East, you find very few such accounts of violence. Okay, there's a very different spatial organization of the city of Calcutta, which actually found many refugees. They moved outside Calcutta. There is a whole area outside Calcutta called Potharshesh, which means end of the road, which is where they went. We know they went to Dandakaranya. There was no violence. We know. I was in Himachal at a conference on partition at St. Bede's, where we learned, to our delight and to our great interest, about what happened in what was then Pepsu, which is Punjab and East Patiala States Union, no Himachal then. But the kinds of experiences, not violent at all, but extremely interesting. Now, I'm saying, yes, we know about cities where these sort of clubs have been marked. But I'm saying that experience that we generally recall is very dominated by the Punjab experience of partition. I think we should move away from that a little bit. I really do feel that it's had a very sort of important place in the scholarship, but it has managed to eclipse all the. which is not, which doesn't make very fruitful or comparison or at all. It becomes that one story. So I'm glad that Urvashi brought up that point about Mysore, for example. You know, south of the Vindhyas, partition doesn't exist at all. I can tell you that. They're simply not interested. It's a North Indian preoccupation. They're just not interested. They keep referring to it as your partition. I've heard, though it didn't affect the south of India at all. Well, it's not in the same way. It affected the whole of India. But the way it has been constructed is as though it happened, as though what happened in Punjab actually happened in the whole country. It didn't.
Yes.
Ishan, can I come in here with some comments on the question you were asking about cities? Just adding to what Ritu has said. I think it's true that, as she's saying, that it was different across the country in different places. And that has to do partly with different patterns of migration and displacement. In the Punjab, it was in one like continuous stream for a few months, whereas in the East, it was a little bit different, and in other places, it was a little bit different. I imagine it also has to do with the ways in which urban places were resettled. And, partly it would be like, if you go to Jangpura in Delhi, you will see that the almost the entire refugee area is filled with people from Rawalpindi, because they moved together as a group and they asked to be housed there as a group. But in other areas, you may not have that location. So sometimes there is that aspect that people move together in kafilas and then they ask to be housed there. Sometimes it is the policies of housing where disparate evacuee property was allocated to disparate people, where you might have a more mixed kind of thing. And sometimes it is also the caste and minority biases in the minds of the servants of the state. So you see that there were, for example, Harijan housing places made and others and so on, which repeated the pattern that existed before. So I don't think these were patterns necessarily created by partition, but certainly the opportunity provided or available at partition to actually mingle and mix housing and create a different kind of mixing of peoples, that didn't happen, I guess, because also of the moment that it was. One of the things I'd be very interested in knowing, and I haven't seen any work on it, but it would be interesting if there is some, is on how the city of Faridabad, which was constructed specifically as an urban city by Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. So here is a woman who's doing, this idea of a planned city to house 50,000 plus refugees and create industry. How that took on board the different identity formations in the people. Was it only for upper class people, or what was it like? Was it very mixed? It would be very interesting to know. And I'm sure that's available information somewhere. I just haven't seen it. So there's many things in this, I think, that we need to look at. Ritu has fallen off again, I think.
Yes, yes. But I think she and you both made an important point, and a point that was made in the last session also, that we have to move beyond violence, because reducing the experiences of partition to violence would be a big understatement and a big mistake on our part on understanding a wholesome, the history of partition. And I think that's an important contribution that this series would make among the citizens, that it would inform them that there is something beyond violence. There are other experiences also, be it the experiences of various experiences of women, because all experiences are unique in their own ways. Maybe the narrative might be same, but experiences are unique, and we must not homogenize them as one experience, which I think we are doing for many, many decades. and celebrating 14th August as the horror remembrance day or whatever that the government is doing might make it a homogeneous uh, understanding of the partition for our future generations. But because we have so many audience questions, I'll just ask one last question to both of you, that when you started, you both are among the pioneers of feminist perspective of partition in India. uh, there were not many people who wrote about the women's experience. So for feminists like you, how was this experience of retrieving that women's agency of partition, those experiences, and why did you think that telling the women, the tale of the women is important in this understanding of partition?
Well, let me start by saying that I did not set out to seek out women's history specifically. I set out really to seek out the histories of, within quotes, ordinary people, and started randomly with my family history. When I was confronted, or when my attention was brought to stories of women, I was actually ashamed of my ignorance, because I had gone into this as a feminist, as somebody who had been deeply involved in the women's movement. And I should have seen it, known it, understood it, but I didn't. And even then, for me to, to the question of family violence, which is something that all feminists know and have understood over the years, also came as a surprise. So the question of sexual assault of women by the public rapes that happened and so on, that didn't come as so much of a surprise, but the question of family violence was a bit of a shock, even though I knew as a feminist that it happens. And then there were many lessons for me as a feminist, as I began to listen to more and more of the stories of women. One, I'll talk only of one because there isn't time to mention many different things. But one of the notions that I have worked with as a feminist was that as a feminist, there are some silences that you have to break. And one of those silences is the silence around sexual assault and so on. And that by telling those stories, by having women speak those stories, you somehow liberate speech and you somehow free those stories. But I learned over time that that is not a choice for me to make as a researcher. That is the choice for the women themselves, who will or will not say whether they want their story to be made public. And my responsibility is, as a feminist and as a researcher, to them first and foremost, rather than to some abstract notion of truth, where I'll pull out a story which will make the woman vulnerable and she'll have to deal with the consequences. So in a sense, the lessons of feminism learned in the street level involvement of many years stood me in very good stead. But also I should have known better and I didn't. That's something that I always feel that I have to own up to, that I should have known from the start. But anyway, I'm glad I learned those lessons.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Ritu ma'am, are you there? I think she's on mute. She has to unmute.
Hey, unmute yourself, Ritu.
I have. I've unmuted myself.
Yes, ma'am. Now you're audible. The
Yeah.
question is, if you couldn't hear, the question is about you getting into telling the women's experience of partition. Why did you think it is important? It was important to tell the tale of partition through a feminist perspective.
It began in can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes?
ma'am. You're audible. Yes, yes.
Oh. It began with a story that I was told by a friend who's a journalist. Nirupama Dutt is her name. She's a journalist who now lives in Chandigarh. She recommended me in 1984, after Mrs. Gandhi's assassination. And this old lady said to Nehru, she turned to her and she said to her in Punjabi, Miyan wali de bas nikal chuki hai idhron. So Nehru was a bit disconcerted and she said, Mataji, kedi bus? Has the bus for Miyan wali already left? Is what she asked her. So Nehru said she didn't know what she meant. So she asked her to repeat the question, at which point this old lady got completely confused and just walked off. Nehru said that what she thought had happened was that she had confused 1984 with 1948. That thing just completely blew my mind. And it relates. What had happened in 1984 that confused this woman at such a deep level, at such a profound level that dislocation, she thought she was back in 1948 to Miyan wali. I thought this is something that, had simply never, ever been anywhere in my thinking at all. The second was the extreme following Mrs. Gandhi's assassination. We said that this violence is within the tradition of the country. This violence is homegrown. This violence has emerged from us. And it is the women who were articulating this, as we learned, not from direct experience, but from Nagrik Ekta Manch, from others who worked with women, with widows whose husbands had been slaughtered, burnt, and so on, raising this question, which actually became a very important question about and that whole question of religion-based division and, the fact that it never, ever leaves you. So decided, okay, let's see if there's something here that needs to be. And they said it's the partition. A lot of the Sikh partition. We lived through one, now we're living through another. So that those two sort of, I don't know what to call them, I guess epiphany in a way, but seems like the wrong word, said, okay, let's see what we can, is there something we can do? I mean, we are not historians, we are not academics even, but yes, we are feminist, and we have been concerned with these questions of how representation is done, what is the invisibility that happens in historical accounts, who gets to write the story, who represents whom, what are the silences, what does that invisibility actually conceal, how deliberate is it, how, and that whole constructed sort of edifice of scholarship on partition, what is it that it has simply not thought worth exploring? And why has it remained only a question of high politics and transfer of power and transfer of assets and who gets what and so on and so forth? And is there what they say, that the weak have the purest sense of history because they know anything can happen. And so we thought, well, let's speak to the weak and the powerless and see how that history is experienced, how that history that was made was experienced, of course, by so many who are dispossessed and powerless, but our focus was women. So it's a transformative experience, I can just say that.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And as you said that you are not historian, but your works have inspired so many historians and young oral historians, and your works have been they have worked as guides and for many more researches on partition. So truly inspiring work that both of you have done in this field. But there are so many questions with me about what both of you said, be it the stories that are told and retold. I wanted to ask about the generational transference of memory, because I think it's also an important aspect, because you said that the generation that experienced partition is no longer there. I think almost everybody from the generation is gone. Then I think the best part of the conversation was that we also focused on Northeast and the other neglected sites of partition, because as Urvashi ma'am also mentioned and Ritu ma'am mentioned, that more than often that we always focus on Punjab, the rich Punjabi refugees who came to Delhi or went to Lahore, and what happened to their male members of their family, or even the privileged women of that family, which had a better exposure to the public space, because we talked about the private space becoming public after partition, when they had to live on the road, and there was no domesticity. This privilege of domesticity which was there to many women maybe before partition. But let's take three audience questions before we wrap up the conversation, because already 1 hour 30 minutes of the conversation. We'll take just three short questions from the audience. There is a question by AQ Nadeem. His question is, how do women perceive a sense of belonging? Is it different from men and women? The sense of belonging in men and women, are they fundamentally different, and how did that shape after partition?
Let me just jump into that. I don't know, because we didn't really interview too many men. We did interview a few in Bengal, as I said. And there, again, as with many other aspects of it, this sense of belonging is never a permanent or a settled thing. Do you see what I mean? You can't say at one point of time, yes, here's where I belong, and this is where I will belong forevermore. Do you see? Meaning this notion of it being a permanent, settled condition, I think is very elusive. What we encountered and what I tried to present through those bits of writing was actually a sense of unbelonging. This to me is a much more fruitful avenue of exploration, because what it allows you to uncover is precisely the instability and the insecurity of identity. That for me is an aspect of belonging that I think needs to be explored. The unreliable immanence of this business of who you are and where you belong, and what is it that constitutes or allows that sense of belonging to happen, to occur. What is it? After all, if I ask you that question, what would your reply be as a young man? How do you experience a sense of belonging? And similarly, if you were to ask me, or if we were to ask Urvashi, or we were to ask anybody in the audience, male and female, how do you, it is contingent on so many things, on where we are today, on where we have come from, on where we expect to be, on what our expectations are, on what is predictable and what is completely unknown, is all constitutes that sense of belonging. Obviously, it is going to be different, not just for men and women, but for different men and different women, in different places and in different contexts. It's not a question that can be answered in a conclusive way at any, it may be answered a little bit conclusively at a particular point of time. I can say, yeah, I belong now to Delhi, or I belong now to India. And yet at the back of my mind is always this place called Lahore, though I have never lived there, but I have been there and experienced a shock of recognition. Where did that come from? Not from a sense of belonging, but from what I call inherited memory. This is another aspect of memory, this generational inheritance that we have. I've never lived in Lahore. I encounter it only through someone else's memory, someone else's experience. But I have an instantaneous sense of belonging. What does that mean? Does it mean I belong there? No, not at all. Does my living here mean I belong here? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. So I think that this is a very open-ended, very fluid, very changeable, condition.
Nadeem, if I could just add briefly to what Ritu is saying, I think also there is, we can't ask that question only in the context of partition, because any sense of belonging or unbelonging that women might carry with them would have come up in their lives in the pre-partition context as well. And very often, as you know, in at least middle-class North Indian families, but I'm guessing in most Indian families, regardless of religion, a woman doesn't even belong in her own natal home. The whole thing is that she is to go someplace else, and that will be her real home. And then that someplace else she goes is never her real home. And you see in partition, during partition, this question comes up in very different and very sharp ways. It's not only to do with nation and country or even family, but it is also to do with, say, for an abducted woman, just as an example, who falls in love with her abductor, it has been known to happen, or who is married to her abductor, regardless of whether she falls in love with him or not, who now has children and whose home in the country which she supposedly belongs to is now close to her. How would she experience belonging? And to what? And what would be the pulls that would pull her to belong to a certain place, identity, space, whatever? So I think we have to try and understand all of those in the context of history, to understand what belonging constitutes, and then perhaps see whether it might be different for the genders. It's a big question without an easy answer.
Thank you so much for your responses. And again, Ritu ma'am pointed out another interesting point that we said, this generational inheritance of memory. And I think that is an important part that we couldn't discuss because of the paucity of time, but hopefully we'll have another conversation sometime where we can explore these. There is a question with Drishti Verma. Her question is it possible to say the concepts of honor, community, religion, and nation are patriarchal in nature, and hence women are not able to identify themselves with those concepts, or neither they could write about these concepts?
I'd say yes, they're patriarchal in nature, but that doesn't mean women can't identify themselves or are not able to. Women often identify with things that are patriarchal.
And in fact, not only identify, but perpetuate. So that's very much, as they say, bargaining with patriarchy is an old strategy, and that bargain requires a certain amount of subservience, a certain amount of consent to it, to the patriarchal norm, and so of course, we have to remember participate in it. It's just a fact of life.
Yes. Um, there is,
Patriarchy requires consent. Am I audible? No.
you weren't audible for I think in between, but yeah.
No, all I said was that patriarchy wouldn't exist if it weren't for women's consent to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for your responses. There is one last question that we'll take. Shashwata Bhattacharya asks how the concept of Andar Mahal broke with refugee crisis in post-partition Bengal as the women had to go outside to work.
I don't actually have an answer to that. Haven't done enough work on that. But I think that it's a very interesting question, Shashwata, which ties in with this whole question of spatiality and how the private and the public were defined. And I think it'd be really interesting to see more research on this. But having not done any work on Bengal, I don't feel qualified to answer that question. Maybe Ritu can.
No, as I said, that the very few interviews that we did in Bengal were of extremely indigent women. And of course, they would have done the same work in East Pakistan, because this was then East, before, they had come before Bangladesh was created, was made. By the way, I've always wondered why we never refer to the creation of Bangladesh as the partition of Pakistan. How come? How come we never call it that? And yet it was partitioned. And they have always said it was a member that India engineered, just as Pakistan was the dismemberment of India that the Muslim League engineered, so on and so forth. Anyway, as I said, though the women that we spoke to were so poor and so without recourse to anything, that they were working before they might, as Urvashi has said even earlier, the very poor were moved. And unlike Punjab, the Hindus in the East were actually agricultural labor. They were not land owning, the majority of them. They were not land owning as they were in the West. One of the very interesting things about the rehabilitation of refugees from West Pakistan to West Punjab to East Punjab was how they would actually allot the land, because the land in East Punjab was totally infertile. The irrigation was all in the West, hence the canal colonies. There was no water in the East. So the arable land was very limited, and yet the number of refugees that needed to be resettled was much larger than the quantity of land, because they were land owning. That question did not arise in the East because they were landless. It was mainly agricultural labor. It was peasantry. The Hindu population was peasantry. Okay, that came across when they did come across. The women and men took whatever they could. Being a restrictive and a restrict, because they were not in Andar Mahal from where they came. Upper class women who moved very gradually over a long period of time. And whether they worked or they didn't work, that, as Urvashi says, is an area for research and for study, which certainly I have not done. But it would be very interesting to see what that very slow migration over, let's say, 10 or 15 years of upper middle class or middle class, the professional class that moved, what that would have meant in terms of their taking up employment outside the home.
Thank you so much, Ritu ma'am. Thank you so much, Urvashi ma'am, for taking out time for this conversation. I think it was enlightening for me, enriching for our audience and for all of us. Thank you so much. It was truly an honor hosting both of you on Karwaan this evening. And I
Thank
hope
you,
you liked the
Ishana.
conversation.
Thanks a lot. It was great.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Thank
ma'am.
you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, ma'am.
Bye.
And those who are watching us, thank you so much for joining in. Today we had this honor of hosting Ritu Menon and Urvashi Butalia for a conversation on the women's experience. And I think we really got to learn a lot about their experience, and not just of Punjab. We went beyond the regional focus to northeast, to Bengal, to other parts of India. So in the first session, we talked with Sohail Hashmi and Ishtiaq Ahmed Sahib on the impact of partition on two cities, Delhi and Lahore. In the second session, we spoke to three young, dynamic oral historians, Anchal Malhotra, Anam Zakaria, and Kavita Puri, on various aspects of oral history writing pertaining to partition. In today's session, we talked about the women's experience of partition. On 16th of July, we have our fourth session, which is on impact of partition on food. We have four amazing historians, writers, chefs joining us. We have Professor Pushpesh Pant, Mariam Jilani, who lives in Philippines, is of a Pakistani descent. We have Chef Ranveer Barar and Pritha Sen to talk about Bengal and Bangladesh, East Pakistan in some senses. So we will cover three different regions, which is West Pakistan, India, and East Pakistan, and their food cultures, how partition impacted undivided Bengal and undivided Punjab. So thank you so much for joining in. If you liked the session, if you like the series, feel free to contribute to our Keto crowdfunding. We are raising funds to sustain Karwaan. You can also send YouTube super chats or become YouTube channel members. One of the you know benefits of becoming a member is that you get to join our WhatsApp book club, where we also do monthly book readings and book discussions on various topics and themes. So we look forward to seeing you all. And today we all missed our co-host Sadaf Bhai. I think he'll join us for the second session, because being an author, he's also a wonderful chef. So looking forward to that conversation. Please do join us on 16th July at 5 p.m. IST on this YouTube channel. Do subscribe, do share, do like this video. Do comment your questions. If you have any questions, we'll be happy to share those questions with our speakers. If you couldn't get the chance of asking it in the live conversation, during the live